Time travel to a simpler time. Do you remember? Let me take you back in time. My early childhood was spent in the 40s and 50s in central Kansas. My parents and most of my aunts and uncles lived within a quarter of a mile of Grandma and Grandpa. If you grew up with no indoor plumbing, outdoor outhouse, a wood-burning stove, ice box that you actually put ice in, no TV, no telephone, no air conditioning, and an old stand-up tube radio, if you were lucky, you lived in a simpler time. I grew up with my cousins when our grandparents' home was still in the country. Now that home is in town. When I was a little kid, me and my cousins all played outside and didn't come in until it was dark. I remember getting a bath in a wash tub outside, and it was only warmed by the sun heating the water. In the wintertime, it was still in a wash tub, but in front of a wood stove. If we got in trouble at school, we got a spanking, and we got another one when we got home. If we did something we weren't supposed to, our parents knew before we got home. That's because neighbors looked out for each other and for each other's children. It wasn't until the mid-50s when Grandma got indoor plumbing. That was a hand pump at the kitchen sink and cold water only. She finally got air conditioning, which was a swamp cooler. When Grandma got a TV, it had a big old antenna, and she only had 2 stations. Her first telephone was an old hand-cranked box on the wall, and us kids weren't allowed to use it. I wonder how many of you know what a party line is. If Grandma wanted to use the phone, she had to pick up the receiver and listen to see if there was anybody on the line. All of my relatives had guns, and that was to hunt for food or protect the chickens and cattle from coyotes. My brother probably remembers a lot better than I do, because he is 5 years older. Boy, could I tell you some stories about my brother when he was younger. He could tell you that when you got in trouble, Grandma sent you out to get a switch, which she was going to use on you. That's right, we had to get our own switch, and if it was too small, Grandma would go out, get a whole limb. But the bottom line is, we respected our grandparents, our parents, and adults. If you grew up in the city, that was a whole different world. I long for those days because families went to church together, they prayed together, they read the Bible together, and they ate their meals together, and they talked to each other. That was a time when people were not afraid to share the love of Jesus. If you grew up in the 40s and 50s, please let me know. I would like to know how many of my friends remember this. If you remember those times, please share them here and tell me where you grew up. This reminds me of this Bible verse. But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 6 through 8.